Gregory Daddis is Professor, Center for War and Society Director, and USS Midway Chair in Modern U.S. Military History at San Diego State University. After graduating from West Point, Professor Daddis served for 26 years in the U.S. Army, retiring as a colonel. He's a veteran of both Operations Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom, and his military awards include the Bronze Star, the Legion of Merit, and the Meritorious Service Medals. He's the author of 5 books, including a trilogy on the American War in Vietnam with Oxford University Press, and most recently, Pulp Vietnam, War and Gender in Cold War Men's Adventure Magazines, which we at Cambridge published in October, and which you will be hearing about now. He's also published numerous scholarly articles in some of his field's leading journals, as well as op-ed pieces and commentaries in publications including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and Salon. So welcome, Greg, and thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Cecelia. It's good to see you.
So, we're going to do, I'm going to be asking Greg some questions. And as I said, please, the audience should feel free to submit their questions throughout, and I will intersperse your questions with mine as we talk to Greg today. So Greg, I'd love to start by just having you talk a little bit about the book. What is it about? Why did you write it? Why is it important? And why do we need to read it?
Yeah, sure. So the reason I wrote it, it really started at West Point. I was teaching at West Point in the history department at the time that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in September of 2011. And so topics of gender were pretty prevalent at the time, especially in our department. And a great colleague of mine, Jen Kiesling, and I decided that we wanted to teach the department's first ever War and Gender course. And we spent a few years kind of putting the course together. And in the spring of 2015, we taught this course. And as we were into the Cold War, reading K.A. Cortalone's wonderful Manhood in American Political Culture in the Cold War, I started searching for these images of pop culture images of men serving in the military. And this was one of the first ones that I came across, which was the cover of American Manhood in January of 1953. And it just was amazing to me, right? You just look at this photograph of the front cover. This guy is bulging like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime. And at the top of it, there's insights into an article about sex. And you look on the green inset, and there's an article inside about Hell's Hill in Korea. And so as I was finishing up my my last book on American strategy in Vietnam withdrawal, I wasn't sure I had that much more to say about U.S. strategy in Vietnam. And what I wanted to do was kind of continue down this exploration of these illustrations and depictions of masculinity during the Cold War. And what I found was there wasn't a lot of serious scholarship on what was then known as men's adventure magazines, or the pulps. And I think in large part, much of this kind of historical literature was dismissed because it was lowbrow. It wasn't considered to be serious. And what I found, in fact, was it was really speaking to a lot of what American men at the time were going through in the Cold War era, and bringing together two very distinct conceptions of masculinity, I think unlike any other that you see during the Cold War era. On one hand, you have these ideas of the heroic warrior, which you saw on the cover of American Manhood. And then right next to that, and oftentimes intertwined, was this conception of the sexual conqueror. And what I found really interesting about this was that both of these conceptions of manhood, of the heroic warrior and the sexual conqueror, were during this time of incredible anxiety during the post-war era, that American men were concerned, or many of them at least, concerned about their masculinity, concerned about what their place was in society after World War II. And so what I wanted to do is examine how these cultural norms that were being expressed in these magazines, even though they've been dismissed as this kind of lowbrow kind of art, I think were actually pretty prevalent of larger ideas about what men were going through in the Cold War era. And at the same time, I think we're leaving men, especially their readers, with a very distorted sense of what war was going to be like. And I think what they did, at least in my research and what I argue in the book, is they help normalize certain expectations. And I think what they did is they saw this what we would call today hyper masculinity and perhaps even sexual violence as acceptable. And what I wanted to do was take a look at how these magazines and these cultural norms were having an impact on their readership, which was then going to Vietnam, and how they were imbibed by this consistent messaging that was linking the heroic warrior military service with the sexual conqueror and sexual entitlement. And so why I think this is important is because these culturally constructed, I guess, expectations of war matter. And I think how we think about war isn't just through military service, but it's also how we talk to each other in larger American culture. And I think from the pulps, the expectation was that men should go to war and then they should be rewarded for going to war, oftentimes through conquering the local female population, especially while serving overseas. And so, you know, I think many of these themes that we see in the pulps are, I think we'll talk about today, are prevalent in today's society. The anxieties, the concerns over masculinity, and that's why I think these magazines continue to be important and worthy of our exploration.
So, so why then did the pulps depict women the way that they did at the time? And what were the consequences then and now? What are the consequences now?
Yeah, it's really interesting, Cecilia. There's so many depictions of women in these magazines, and Heather Sturr has talked about this in her book Beyond Combat, about multiple constructions of women. And you see the same thing in these magazines, and I'll share a few of them with you now. And I just want to kind of warn the audience, some of these are obviously sexist, if not completely misogynistic, but I think they give us an insight into what these magazines are showing at the time. And clearly, some of those depictions of women are sexually appealing. These magazines are taking their cues from World War II era pinups. They include these photographic spreads that are known here as cheesecakes. And you see this one article from 1953 that is from a photographer who's explaining how through these various stages of undress that these cheesecakes are shown. And I think we also need to realize that this is an era where there's very few alternatives to sex in popular culture, especially in the period before Playboy. And so you see a number of ads that are for lingerie products or stag movies or even pornographic photos that are prevalent in the magazines. And so that's one depiction. There's also this depiction of women being in distress, the damsel in distress motif, which is commonly featured. And you know, you just look at this artwork and, you know, I find this obviously very menacing. But this is part of the construction of women at the time, that they need to be saved by strong American men. And they're always being tortured by Nazis or ex-Nazis, and then later almost always by communists, and needing savior by the strong American man. And part of that depiction then is that those men who are conquering military heroes will be rewarded for their exploits on the battlefield, that women are in many instances depicted as sexual rewards. And there's also a racial component to this, which we shouldn't be surprised by, and that is the exotic Asian woman, or the exotic Oriental, which is prevalent throughout much of the men's adventure magazine. So you see a number of constructions here, which I think are important in terms of how men are depicting women at the time. But my sense is that these multiple depictions also are a problem for many young readers, because how do you distinguish whether a woman is dangerous or desirous? And in many cases, it's the former, that they're very dangerous in these depictions. And you'll see these articles that will have titles like "Death Wore a Tight Bikini," or these young girl wolf packs that are terrorizing American cities. And so I think this leads to an increased sense of anxiety among many young male, especially virginal readers, that, women are depicted as either toxic vehicles carrying STDs, and you saw this in a lot of World War II posters during the day. There are these fears that women might be a sexual reward, but as a man, I might underperform in my sexual relations with women. You see a lot of articles about men being anxious about their sexual performance. So I think that's a component to all this. And then there's also a class component as well, that many of these women, especially ones that are portrayed as living outside of the traditional conventional sexual norms, are a danger not just to men, but also to larger American society, that they're social degenerates and they're undermining the post-war American society and then the traditional, you know, hierarchy of a patriarchal hierarchy of men needing to be in a place above women. And so what all this does, I think, and why it's important for us today, I think, is because that tension between desire and fear, I think, promotes an underlying sexism that is part and parcel of these magazines. And I think those tensions and that sexism is present today. If you go back and watch the phenomenal, I won't even call it a stand-up, I think it's more social commentary by Hannah Gadsby, in that she's got this wonderful piece in there where she talks about misogyny, and she says that she defines it as something, she says it's a mental illness, but then she says it's something akin that if you hate something that you desire, that's how we should define misogyny. And that really spoke to me as I was actually kind of finishing up this work, is because that's exactly how these magazines were viewing women in many cases, that men were supposed to desire these women, but at the same time they hated them because they were dangerous. And that language that we see of women that are kind of on both ends of the spectrum, I think are present today. I noted in my conclusion of the book, there was a late 2018, September 2018 article in the Federalist that was arguing why the Trump administration needed to keep women out of combat. And this author, who's a Marine, former Marine, was arguing that infantry work was man's work, and female fighters were not only endangering the unit, but endangering themselves. And that language clearly was present in the men's adventure magazines. And I think for something even more contemporary today, if you look at the Fort Hood incidents of assault, I think they illustrate the limitations of sexual assault and harassment prevention training, because it's just that, it's training. They don't look at the deeper cultural roots that I think we need to consider about how we have for decades constructed these depictions of women, and how that feeds into our understanding of harassment and assault. And when you read the report coming out of Fort Hood, it's talking about one of the problems that male commanders are just basically seen as business as usual. That's directly from the report, and women slipping into, as the report says, survival mode and feeling like they're preyed upon. And I think if we just look at the sexual harassment training as just that training, without going back and looking at some much deeper cultural roots, then I think we're missing something, and probably will be limited in our response to how we deal with this. So again, I think this is why it's important.
Greg, the source material is so rich with these pulps, and a question just came in that I want to interject here, because I think it's important to talk about this, and also fascinating. Someone is asking about the source material and says they guess a lot of these magazines are not in the Library of Congress collection. So, right. Where did you find all of these? And that in and of itself is an interesting story, right?
Yeah, it is. And I was very fortunate to be linked up with a gentleman who runs a website dedicated to these men's adventure magazines, and has actually published quite a number of books that are reprints of articles and illustrations. And he kind of helped me get in contact with folks that were in this community, collectors. And actually I was able to do some research by going down to a large warehouse in Tampa, Florida that had not only men's adventure magazines, but comics and baseball cards and kind of all this cultural material from the Cold War era. So that got me started by being able to purchase a large number of these magazines. And then I was able to go to places like eBay and other online sources as I was getting more familiar to purchase specific magazines. What is in the National Archives, which I did access, were the War Crimes Working Group files. And what I wanted to do was kind of compare the language that was in the pulp magazines to the language that was in just that, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ proceedings, for criminal activities related to rape and sexual assault. And what was interesting, if not frightening, was there was a parallel in the language that you're seeing in these magazines and the testimony coming out of these criminal proceedings as men are discussing and defending themselves against allegations of rape and sexual assault. So you see a sense of parallelism here in terms of the language being used in these cultural products to what you're seeing in the criminal proceedings of the army that's serving in Vietnam.
So, you know, you talked a little bit about this, that the pulp spoke to men's anxieties about their masculinity, obviously, and offered solutions that made things like hypermasculinity and even sexual violence seem acceptable. So do these magazines speak to current social anxieties? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think they do. And, you know, these anxieties were always just below the surface in the men's magazines, but not far below the surface. In fact, you know, I think read in a certain way, these magazines can be seen as a form of escapism from some very deep anxieties about not measuring up in a rapidly changing post-war society. And again, I think that's where you see the connections today about young men who feel that they're not able to keep up with rapid social and cultural changes. And so you'll see these stories of millions of anxiety-ridden American men. And here's one as an example from early 1963, you know, talking about the mental and emotional castration of husbands and these fears of them being converted into housemaids, and how these frustrated females, as one article said, were waging an all-out campaign on men. And so, in one sense, I think these grand stories and amazingly evocative artwork can be seen, I think, as an antidote from many men who saw wives as being stifling or felt constrained by these domestic responsibilities. And you know, this article, written in March of 1963, is exactly the same time when Betty Friedan is publishing The Feminine Mystique, which talks about this male outrage of what she says men are seen as parasitic women who are keeping their husbands and sons from growing up, which I think is really fascinating. And so these images, I think, speak to a certain sense of wish fulfillment, that there's a fantasization going on here of trying to reach out to a potential that you know, is being stifled by these women. And again, I think you see that today. And you know, if we can look at images from the magazines and compare them to images from our former president's Twitter account, you see just this, I think, not just a fantasization going on here, but I would argue clearly an anxiety just below the surface. You know, both of these images show an idealized version of masculinity. The pulps almost invariably had these articles, advertisements for Charles Atlas and weightlifting and other things. But you know, it's improbable that any of these average readers were going to attain this. And you know, let's be honest, if you look at our former president, he was no paragon of physical fitness. And so I think there's something to be said here about, you know, how these anxieties are at play still today. And my sense is that how this is depicted in real world is kind of lashing out, and you see, as one recent article said in the Atlantic, that during the Trump era, what we saw was this kind of drive for dominance. And I think a lot of that drive for dominance, this construction of masculinity and manliness on being a claim to authority, a claim to power, if you will, is very much one that's rested on anxieties. And I think when you kind of take that to its worst, most logical end state, then there is a consensus then that those anxieties lead to sexual assault, because sexual assault is often far less about sexual satisfaction than it is about exerting sexual power. And so this sense of anxiety being a drive towards dominance and power, I think ultimately is present today, and clearly was present in the magazines during the Cold War era, and arguably was present in actual American experiences of soldiers in Vietnam.
There's a question that came in asking if these magazines ever center on non-white American men. It seems that these texts seem to universally present a viewpoint of the unmarked category of white Christian masculinity.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer, quite simply, is yes. That these magazines cater to a white working class audience. You see that in the articles, you see that in the advertisements. This is the same audience that makes up the bulk of American ranks in Vietnam. And very rarely do you see minorities, African Americans appear in the pulp pages. And only occasionally, very occasionally, will they focus on contemporary racism. And I think that's purposeful, because if you're catering to a white male audience, that means that men in minority groups shouldn't be and will not be recognized as full, real men. And again, I think there's an anxiety that underlies this, that there are racial fears and sexual anxieties that are proscribing Black men from being more. And, you know, if the heroes are white, the pulp writers at the time can combine those martial exploits with sexual conquest. You can't do that in the 1950s and 1960s if your hero is an African American man. Black men cannot be sexual champions in the 1950s and 1960s, especially if the damsel in distress is white. And again, I think you see some parallels here today, right? That, you know, many of these Proud Boys will reject the label of white supremacist, but they're still arguing for a platform to save America and to defend Western values. And even when you look at, I think, just this awful tweet that former Secretary Pompeo put out about wokeism and multiculturalism not being who we are, not who America is. Not only is that ridiculous from a historical standpoint, but I think it's very much centered on this idea that only white men should have power. And again, I think that's why going back and looking how the Cold War constructions of gender and masculinity were so prevalent in the day, and how those same tones, that same language is being used at the highest form of government, whether it's the president tweeting or a Secretary of State, you know, saying that multiculturalism is not who we are as Americans. I think it speaks to those white male anxieties.
Yeah, you mentioned Proud Boys. Are there other examples of militarized masculinity today that you want to mention?
Yeah, it's they're all over the place, right? If we think about the conversations that we've had over mask wearing. If you recall, it was Robert O'Neill, the Navy SEAL, who tweeted out that he doesn't wear a mask on a plane because he's not a pussy. If you think about Ben Shapiro, who lost his mind because Harry Styles was wearing a quote unquote fluffy dress, and that was a referendum on American masculinity, or Candace Owens following it along in the same suit, saying that feminization and Marxism were going hand in hand. If we don't understand how both of those are an outright attack on American values, then we're missing something. So I think very much those concepts, those ideas are still with us today, to the point where I would argue they're even becoming parody, right? That if you think about Dan Crenshaw, congressman from Texas, who was a veteran himself, who was wounded in combat, he's actually, I would argue, become a cartoonish caricature of himself. He's become a parody of himself. If you recall this video of him para-jumping in to the Georgia runoff elections, why does he have to do that? Why does he have to demonstrate his martial masculinity in such a ridiculous way? And I think along the same lines, if you look at these right-wing all-male groups like the Proud Boys, they're dressed up like military cosplay in a sense. They see themselves as aggrieved and marginalized and depressed, and so the antidote to that, like in the Pulp venue, is to revert back to a militarized sense of masculinity by even just dressing up like a combat infantryman. And so I think that imagery is really important, because you see it in the pulps, and very much I think you see it today, where a right-wing critic, conservative critic like Ben Shapiro will lose his mind because Harry Styles is wearing a dress, without considering just the history behind that of David Bowie, Prince is just two examples, and so I think we're still working through as a society how we view our illustrations of who is and who should be a man.
So I want to talk a little bit about you as the author of this book. And does the fact that you're a man with a background in the military, did that make it easier for you to write a book like this? And do you think it affects the way that people receive this material?
I think the unfortunate answer is yes, it does. I had a great discussion early on when I was conducting research, and I hope I'm not outing her here, but a phenomenal historian, Meredith Lair, who's got this terrific book, Armed with Abundance, on consumerism during the Cold War era. And Meredith was just super helpful in my research, pointing me in the right directions to look at PX records, post-exchange records in the National Archives, for me to find the data of how these magazines were being consumed by soldiers in Vietnam. And we had this really long conversation, and then Meredith at the end said, I'm really jealous of you. And it kind of took me off guard. And she said, I'm jealous because I can't write this book. She said, because I'd be immediately dismissed as a female academic, and then all the pejoratives that would follow. And so I think my background has, again, unfortunately, allowed me to get this out in a way that provides some cover, at least for folks to look and read the book on its own merit, and look at the scholarship on its own merit without immediately being dismissed of, well, this is clearly a female liberal academic, and therefore it's all a bunch of bunk. And I think, yeah, I just think it's an unfortunate reality.
Here's a question from the audience that's asking about the cartoonish nature of these images, and saying a lot of the imagery of the Vietnam era military manuals and documents strikes me as having a similarly cartoonish nature, and is saying these are official doctrinal manuals. Why are they so dumbed down? And is this cartoonish element still a feature of US military documents today?
I imagine they're not today. I haven't seen many doctrinal manuals in the last 5 or so years, but I'm assuming the person that's asking the question is talking about a pretty popular magazine back in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. It was PM magazine. It was a preventative maintenance magazine, and there was this kind of rough and tough, very barrel-chested sergeant that would kind of take you through each of the magazines. They were short, comic book-like, and give you maintenance tips. And along the way, there was always this very attractive blonde woman, I can't recall the name of her in the magazines, that was kind of by her side that would also help tell these stories and provide tips on maintenance. I think these illustrations are appealing because they're evocative. And, you know, if we look at this one here from 1967 as an example, just taking aside the phallic nature of this, you know, this is, I think, appealing for many young men who want to see themselves in their own minds as heroic warriors of kind of, in this image here, of straddling a major piece of artillery, which, oh, by the way, the armed forces of the National Liberation Front didn't actually have. But, you know, defending or defeating the enemy with a bayonet in one hand and a grenade in the other. And, you know, this is attractive, I think, for some readers who were imagining going on into this fantasy world and seeing themselves as possibly heroes in the Cold War era, either on their way to Vietnam or even in Vietnam. There was a significant portion of American soldiers in Vietnam that were reading these magazines. As I mentioned earlier, I was able to get the PX data, and every month these types of magazines, the Pulps and Men's Adventure magazines, were in the top 10, top 20 of all magazines that were being sold in Vietnam. The same held true for Korea as well. So I think for even those soldiers, 75% of which never actually saw combat in Vietnam, this was a way for even them to fantasize about what war would be like and how they too might be able to become heroes by assaulting enemy positions like this. And then again, with the construction being there, that if I was able to attack and defeat this enemy emplacement and kill the enemy, then the other part of the deal was I would be sexually rewarded for it on the other end when I got back home.
So who was the audience for the pulps? I mean, was it soldiers specifically? Was it all men?
Again, I think there very much was a working class appeal to this. I think for those that were feeling left behind in the post-war era as we entered into this age of consumerism after World War II, that for those that felt like they were being left behind, there was an opportunity here to step away from those Cold War concerns and fantasize about being a heroic warrior. I think there certainly was a target audience of World War II and Korea veterans. Much of these magazines were, the articles were written by veterans themselves. A lot of the magazines had advertisements where you could seek out other veterans and hopefully reconnect with folks with whom you had served earlier in either Korea or in World War II. And I think they were very much geared toward adolescents, those young teenagers and young men who were looking for heroic fantasy storylines and also, again, looking for pictures, illustrations of sex, that this was an opportunity for them to, again, in the age before the popularity of Playboy, to get their hands on a magazine that showcased women in various stages of undress and gave them an opportunity to fantasize in a multitude of ways. So, you know, in one sense, I think because those magazines are targeting two separate audiences, veterans of World War II and the adolescents, you see a continuity then in those expectations of men that are hoping that their experience in Vietnam will be just like their experiences of the experiences of their uncles and fathers who just came out of World War II. And I think that's the problem in large part with these magazines, is they create this fantasy world of heroic battlefields that just never pan out in Vietnam, and I think increases that disappointment and frustration that many American soldiers feel in Vietnam, because they're never able to truly follow in the footsteps of their fathers of the World War II generation.
Mm-hmm. So someone asks, since the US military at the time featured many conscripts, do you see these magazines reflecting something specific to the American military experience, or do they reflect US society more generally at the time? Did you observe any changes as the military transitioned to a more societally distant, all-volunteer force?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is larger. I don't think that there's that this is just a military construction, a militarized construction of masculinity. I was lucky enough to read Amy Rutenberg's recent work on the Cold War and how there are multiple constructions of masculinity. James Gilbert has also written on this. And so I think it was much larger, that this was a component of militarized masculinity that appealed to not just some, but I think a large portion of American young men coming of age in the Cold War era. So I think this speaks to something not just within the Army, but also and the Marine Corps, but also within larger American society, especially I think when you look at the anxieties that are just below the surface of many of these articles. You know, and it is interesting, right, that these magazines fall out of favor and ultimately go by the wayside at the same time that the American war in Vietnam is coming to an end. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think that the American experience in Vietnam challenges many of these conventional, traditional cultural norms about what masculinity is. And when those cultural norms are exposed as a lie during the American war in Vietnam, the magazines aren't willing to open up their definition of masculinity into something larger. They stick with the cultural, traditional, conventional idea of what masculinity is, and the readership really starts to take a nosedive in the early 1970s. And by the time you get to 1974 and 95, many of these magazines have gone by the wayside or actually transitioned into the skin magazines. So Stag, as an example, which will start off as a men's adventure pulp magazine, by the early mid 1970s, will start making this transition to a full-blown skin magazine a la Hustler. And so what happens is, I think, is that the magazines kind of split apart, and you'll see one side of that original construction focused on sex moving into Hustler and Stag being a skin magazine, and the heroic warrior being separated out from that. And so when you get to 1975, you're seeing the introduction of magazines like Special Forces and magazines on SOF.
Can you say a little bit about how the pulps may have contributed to ideas about war that was self-defeating for soldiers who read them?
I think so. If we go back to that earlier picture I showed you of this heroic American soldier straddling this gun tube, I think what it does is it sets up these false expectations. And I think what's important for us to realize here is that many young men, I think especially those that are thinking about joining the service, find meaning in images and structures of male superiority. I think if you look at the imagery of the Proud Boys, or even the imagery that we saw the rioters and terrorists that attacked the Capitol on the 6th of January, there's very much a militarized component of that. In fact, even as we've noted over the last few days, frighteningly, a large portion of military veterans were part of that riot, and we need to be really careful about how we talk about that. But I think what's important here is that how we talk about war and the images we use, I think those have meaning for consumers. And how we talk about the interactions and the interrelationships between war and sex matter incredibly. That war doesn't necessarily need to be the primary, if only, route to becoming a man. This construction, this idea that the best path to manhood is by military service, I think one that is upended by the American experience in Vietnam, and one that is very much propagated in the pulps. And so I think we need to be really careful about how our pop culture heroes are rewarded sexually for their actions, especially if they're military actions. And my sense is that what we need to start doing is redefining how we think about adventure and war. And these pulps didn't do that at all. In fact, I think they did just the opposite. They set up these incredibly false expectations. They wanted war to be glorious. They wanted combat to be heroic. It doesn't work out that way. But in the process, these magazines are demanding a very narrow conformity, I think, of what we see as men and how we define manhood and masculinity. And I think the final piece of this, which I think is really important, is that in these magazines, none of these soldiers, none of these heroes suffer the consequences of war. And that's just not the case. Whether it's soldiers or civilians in the middle of war, there are consequences: physical, emotional, economic, social, cultural. Those pulp warriors in these magazines never suffered any of the consequences of war. And so I think that has to be part of our conversation as well, not only in decisions to engage in war, but while we're in war. And we need to kind of push back against this idea that military service is nothing more than just heroic combat on battlefields that will allow us to be rewarded in one way or another for that heroism.
Greg, someone asks if you have found these kinds of depictions in other cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. There, I did some. I didn't dive too deep into other cultural magazines, but they're definitely present. Australia and Britain, in particular, had what were known as lad mags. So they were kind of these along the same lines of the U.S. men's adventure magazines. They too, even in Canada, there was a series of lad magazines that came out in the 50s and 60s. What was interesting is they too kind of talked about these kind of Cold War anxieties about measuring up in the post-World War II era. So this wasn't simply an American phenomenon, and it would be interesting, I think, to kind of do a comparative study, if you will, of these American-centric men's magazines and comparing them to the lad mags of the 50s and 60s in Britain, Australia, and Canada. I didn't see much, at least I didn't do any research of these types of magazines outside of Western culture. So I'm not sure if they were prevalent outside of Europe as the Cold War was unfolding.
So how much has changed since the time of these pulps? And are contemporary representations that much different?
I think they've changed in matter of degree, but maybe not in a matter of essence. And I think if we go back to July of this last year, where Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez was verbally accosted on the steps of the Capitol, she goes on afterward to deliver what I thought up till a few days ago was one of the most powerful speeches. And I think compared to Gorman's poetry reading the last few days, I think AOC's speech on the House floor, I think, was one of the most powerful we've seen in quite some time. And what Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez was saying was that, these this kind of vitriol that you saw from Congressman Yoho from Florida were part of a much larger pattern of behavior toward women. And what she says on the House floor is that this isn't new, and that's part of the problem, that it is cultural. And there is we're in a culture, she said, of that of a lack of impunity, and we accept this violence, and we accept this violent language against women, and the as she says, the entire structure of power that supports it. And so I think, very unfortunately, I don't think that much is, or enough has changed, if you will. So if you kind of look at AOC's comments on the House floor, and then you compare the report coming out of Fort Hood with the problems they've had over quite a bit of time on sexual harassment and assault, that I think it's clear we can make a pretty strong argument that not enough has changed, and that many of these ideas and images that are critical component of the men's adventure magazines are with us today, and we still have a lot of work to do to contest those, and be okay with contesting them, and not feel that that Ben Shapiro critique that if we contest these types of images, that we're somehow losing our masculinity and all of a sudden becoming feminine Marxist. It's just pretty ridiculous.
So someone comments that this is a big shift from your previous work, which your previous work was more traditional military history. What was making the shift to writing about gender and cultural representation like, and what did you have to think about differently?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And, I think for me, in one sense, a lot of my work as a historian has been on popular narrative. So even my work on U.S. strategy in Vietnam was an exploration of why certain popular narratives become popular and why they endure. So why do we believe William Westmoreland only had a strategy of attrition and only cared about body counts? Why do we have these stories where we believe that there was a better war after the Tet Offensive, and we snatched defeat from the jaws of victory? But I think a lot of it, and in the sense that Pulp Vietnam is also about kind of popular narratives about our history. But I think for me, it was really me leaving military service and reflecting on my own time as a soldier and how I perceived my own experience, which I don't think, to be quite honest, I did enough while I was in uniform. I began at West Point only 5 years after the first women had graduated from the military academy. And I am absolutely certain I didn't think about my own experiences deeply enough about what that meant at the time. And I think the other thing, which was, I think, important for me was kind of moving away from a department that focused a lot of its effort, not all of it, but a lot of its effort on traditional military history of teaching cadets about campaigns and leadership and battlefield experiences to move to Chapman University and now to San Diego, where I'm looking more broadly about the relationships between war and society. I think that was what inspired me to kind of move away from where I had been as a historian. And it's been, I think, it's exposed me to a lot of new history, a lot of new ideas. I spent a lot of time reading gender theory that I never would have done before as a historian. I got into a lot of different source material that I never would have gotten into just looking at U.S. strategy in Vietnam. And so this really was a way for me to expand who I was as a historian, and at the same time, like I said, kind of reevaluate my own experiences growing up in the Army throughout the 80s, 90s, and into 2000s.
Another question. I read recently that anger is a way that men who feel disenfranchised can still exert their masculinity and virility. Do you see that in your pulp literature and in what is going on today?
Yeah, that's another great question, and I think the answer is yes. You see if we go back to a few of those earlier images, you clearly see a sense of physical violence that's part of the illustration in these magazines. I think also for American soldiers in Vietnam, it is incredibly frustrating for them, especially those that grow up on the narratives that are propagated in these magazines, that when they get to Vietnam and they expect that they are going to be have the opportunity for heroic battlefield accomplishments and then be sexually rewarded for them. When the first part of that equation doesn't work out, where there is no battlefield where they can demonstrate their bravery, to demonstrate their masculinity, where the enemy is seemingly always has the initiative, where the National Liberation Front forces, the Viet Cong as Americans call them, always seem to be the shadowy figure just outside of the reach of American power. There's a lot of frustration. That frustration turns into anger. And so I think a lot of that frustration, anger is then turned on to the South Vietnamese population as a way for Americans to at least express their power. If I can't express my power and demonstrate my masculinity on the battlefield, well, maybe then I can do it by acting aggressively against the population and taking what I think is due to me. So I think a lot of that anger and frustration comes from these false expectations that are delivered in the magazines. But we need to be really careful about that. I don't want to argue, and I didn't in the book, that if you read the magazines, that was going to lead you toward sexual assault or rape against the South Vietnamese population, because I don't think that the lines were ever neatly that drawn, or that ever drawn that neatly. What I do argue, though, is that what these magazines do at the time, and I think what we might discuss today, is they open up a narrative that is acceptable. That when you read these magazines, what is acceptable in their depictions of combat, of war, is that interrelationship between the heroic warrior and the sexual conqueror. And we're having these very conversations today, right? That if you look at the former president's tweets, what was acceptable given those that believe that they should take back what they thought was, wrongly so, a falsely decided election. And so I think, we're still talking about how popular narratives come to being and how they're accepted by those that are consuming them. I think this is at the core of the former president inciting basically insurrection. It's how his viewers on Twitter were consuming the product that he was selling. And I think you see the same thing in these magazines from the Cold War era. They're depicting a sense of war that is that intertwines heroism and sexual conquest in a way that just doesn't match reality, and yet is consumed by the readership nonetheless.
Here's a long question, so let me see if I could. So do you think there are modern parallels to these pulp magazines? And which kinds of texts most closely mirror the ideological and gendered content of the pulps? And do you see some of these ideologies consciously or unconsciously represented in modern texts depicting or referencing the wars and eras in which these pulps were written? In short, how have these concepts, if at all, worked their way into cultural memory?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure if there's a direct parallel to from these magazines to today. I think the closest we may have gotten to were those magazines that were popular in the 90s and early 2000s. Maxim, FHM, those types of magazines that were men's magazines that were directly related to or directly targeted toward a younger audience. The difference, though, is I think these magazines didn't combine war and sex in such a deliberate manner. So I'm not sure what kind of cultural products are out there today that would closely mirror what you saw in in the magazines, although I do think that the language is still there. So I was sharing this with Cecelia and a few others a while back. As the book was getting ready to come out, I posted a number of covers on my Twitter account, and this one retired colonel who believed self-professedly that these conservatives like him had to win the culture war. He said that what we need to do is get back to magazines like this, because this militarized notion of masculinity that was coming out of these magazines was needed today, and I'm quoting him here, because a lot of Americans are pussies. And right below him, another Twitter respondent claimed that, he agreed and said that pussification of America's youth was a matter of national security. So even if there are not direct parallels today of cultural products like these men's magazines, that language, I think, is still there among many, I would argue, right-wing circles, that we're in this cultural war right now. There is a danger of America being feminized, being led by quote unquote liberal pussies. It is a matter of national security. The Pulps were very much worried that young American men coming out of World War II that had not experienced combat and military service weren't going to be able to measure up against this long war that we were entering into, the Cold War against the Soviets and against other international communists. So I think that language is still with us today in certain circles. I just don't know what cultural products would best replicate the Cold War men's adventure magazines.
So we just have time for one more question. And I guess that I want to ask you, just sort of full circle. So, is there a change that you hope this book will facilitate? And it's kind of, why did you write it? But I wonder now, after you've written it and you see how it's being received, if you have a different answer to the question about why you wrote it almost.
I think the answer of why I wrote it remains. I think maybe what I want to, ideally happen with this is probably twofold. I think as a historian, the thing that I might argue coming out of this experience as a historian is to be open to more cultural sources that we might deem as lowbrow. That these magazines, which before I started this, I probably would have just looked at them, laughed, and kind of tossed them aside, just that as cultural debris from the Cold War, are really serious products that we need to wrestle with, and are not just offshoots. Just because they're targeting a working class audience doesn't mean they're important. Doesn't mean they spoke to real fears and real aspirations of many Americans during the Cold War era. That these were serious products, and for a historian, it's opened my eyes that I need to be more understanding and more inclusive of my source base, and not just focus on what I deem is important because it might be lowbrow, as the term was at the time. And I think the other thing, and perhaps more from a practical standpoint, for the current serving armed forces, is, as I alluded to earlier, that we can't understand sexual harassment and assault prevention training as just being annual training. That there are deeper roots, deeper cultural roots that need to be addressed if we're going to collectively work against sexual harassment and assault. You can't just put up a PowerPoint slide presentation once a year in the armed forces, check a block, and say, well, I've got my sharp training done for the year, I'm good to go, and we need to move on to more important things. I think it's important for us to have more open, honest conversations about gender, about its relationship to the military service, and about how we think about gender and power relationships, not just in the Army, but the armed forces as a whole, and the armed forces as a reflection of American society, which clearly it is.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much for talking to us today. Thank you for writing this book. this important book. Thank you for reminding me how lucky I am to get to work on books like this and spend my days working on books like this and with people like you.